Thanks. Anyway, look, thanks a lot for coming. Just so that you might not know who I am, I'll give you a bit of an intro. My name's Scott Wilson. I'm currently just recently become the chair of Penington Institute. I've actually been on the board of Penington well before, when it was called Annex, so for probably the last 13 or so years. I am an Aboriginal person from the Northern Territory. My family is part of the stolen generation. And so, you know, it's really timely, I think, that we are here today, and I'd like to think that today's oration in the lead up to the Victorian state elections and the recent Penington Institute's Regulate It campaign, that one of the roles that I also occupy on top of that is I'm Deputy Co-Convener of the Coalition of the Peaks, National Voice for Coalition of National Voice for Close the Gap. And one of the major gaps is around juvenile justice and adult incarceration. So it's shocking to learn when you come to Victoria that Aboriginal people are 10 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis-related offences. And I know that Professor Penington would have been equally shocked to have learned that after decades of advocating for drug law reform, that people were still being criminalised for cannabis offences in Victoria, but around Australia. But I'll begin today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. And I extend my respect and cultural authority to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that might be here today. We gathered today to honour and celebrate the life and work of Professor David Penington AC, a leader and a passionate advocate for a humane and pragmatic approach to drug policy. This is the second David Penington Oration, celebrating a courageous legacy. David had a diverse and esteemed career, including as a Harley Street specialist in London. He was also Professor of Medicine, Dean and Vice-Chancellor at the University of Melbourne, Chairman of Cochlear, Bio 21 Australia, the Bio 21 Institute, the Bionic Vision Australia, and also Museums Victoria. His contribution to improving drug policy included roles such as the former chairman of the National HIV/AIDS Task Force in the 1980s, the Victorian Premier's Drug Advisory Council in the 90s, and the Victorian Government's Drug Policy Expert Committee at the turn of the century. David was a pioneer in the rational debate on drug-related issues. He gave his name to the Penington Institute in 2014. I want to acknowledge that there are many esteemed guests who are joining us here today. David's wife, Dr. Sonay Hussain, and members of and friends of the Penington family are here. We're also pleased to have here today to honour David's continuing legacy. Members of Parliament who have taken out time for their busy schedules to be here with us as well. We'd also like to acknowledge the Minister for Mental Health, the Honourable Ingrid Stitt, the Leader of the Greens, Ms Sandel, the Shadow Health Minister, Ms Georgina Crozier, members of the Legalised Cannabis Party, Rachel Payne and David Eddington. We'd also, other board members of Penington are here as well, and there's quite a few of them here. Some of them are obviously, because we are streaming today's event live, and as you may or may not know, some of our board members of Penington do live overseas, so we know that at least a couple of them are online. Not sure how many other people might be there, but we'd also like to acknowledge our patrons of Penington Institute who volunteer their time and expertise to lead our organisation and champion our work. And I'd like to acknowledge Mick Palmer, who delivered the inaugural Penington Oration. Unfortunately, Mick's sick, but he is now a member of the board of Penington. Our speakers today include Catherine Greiner, prior chairperson of Penington, and the Honourable Tony Parsons. We'd also like to thank and acknowledge Matthew Hilakari for sponsoring us today at Parliament House so we could have this event. And thank you for those, as I said, joining online from around Australia and internationally. You might also remember or recall or know that the Penington Oration precedes International Overdose Awareness Day, which is occurring on Sunday and is now a global event. For example, I'm based in Adelaide, and we've managed this year to get Adelaide Oval to light up in purple, Parliament House and the University of South Australia. So it's slowly building, unfortunately. People are continually to die and suffer from, drugs because they continually to be illegal. If you need to go to the bathrooms, they're located in the hall outside the room. Speeches will run for about 45 minutes and finish by 2 p.m. We hope you're able to join with us after the speeches with some food, coffee or tea. And if you need anything to learn more about the work of Penington Institute, talk to either myself or some of the Penington staff that are here. So the event finishes at 2:30 unless something unfortunate happens before that. But I'd like to introduce you to Catherine. Catherine to come up, who's going to give an occasional introduction. We're delighted to welcome Catherine. I've known her for quite a number of years now. She's a leader across public and the private sector, government bodies and not-for-profit organisation. She was elected as a councillor of the City of Sydney and has chaired and been on boards of organisations as diverse as investment funds, school councils, ministerial councils and philanthropic trusts. Catherine, until recently, after many years, was chairperson of Penington Institute and stepped down earlier this year. So we're pleased to ask her back today to provide occasional remarks. Welcome, Catherine.
Thank you, Scott, very much. And a warm good afternoon to you all. I can tell you I come from Sydney and it's 20 degrees there today and the sun is shining. But first of all, can I just say thank you all. I'm playing with new glasses because I no longer have to wear glasses. And as I said to one of my friends, nobody will recognise me in the street without my red glasses. So I've got red reading glasses now. But John suggested that what I might do is make what I call casual observations about my time at Penington and some of the changes that we've seen. So as I look back over those 11 or 12 years where I was on the board, we have moved the dial, not as fast as we might have wanted, but we think that we're in that process of continually moving the dial. Because as you know, the Penington Institute is really the only national independent drug policy powerhouse in Australia. And I'm amazed at what this agile organisation can achieve. Ably led now by our wonderful chair, Adjunct Professor Scott Wilson. Scott's the CEO of the Aboriginal Drug and Alcohol Council of South Australia, and you see how much power he can pull within being able to move the government to put purple lights on the arena and on the buildings, and thank you for that lead. I've tucked that one away in the knapsack for New South Wales. And you know, the board is made up of people who are really committed to the issue of harm, drug harm minimisation, and shifting the dial in the community in terms of attitudes and policies. And today we've got Chris Cotter with us, of course, and we've got other directors online, steeped in health, community policy development, research and strategy, and lived experience as members of Parliament. Two from Canada, and they will be picking up this live stream. One lives in Ontario and the other one now lives in Finland, where I think it's 3 o'clock in the morning. So I'm hoping they're not watching live. And of course, we've got people who have a great understanding of public policy. We provide a significant public education and advocacy role, reinforcing the importance of evidence-based reform, which I think is the core of everything that David stood for. And I've often thought at this stage, Sonne, that David would be very proud that we've come to where we are today. David was a zealot, and I mean that in the best words, the best frame of that word. He was a zealot in convincing governments, both Liberal and Labor, both state and federal, to be bold in public health. And because of David's advocacy, we had great changes in the intervention in the HIV/AIDS crisis and in drug policy reform. It was the Hawke Labor government that first introduced needle exchanges in the 1980s. It was a coalition government many years later that opened community access to the anti-overdose drug naloxone. I always get the A's and the O's wrong, naloxone. Both of these policies now enjoy bipartisan support. And that's the thread and the change that we want to see continue. Medical cannabis, first embraced by Labor in Victoria. And Victoria has been known to be leaders in this space, and I think have a role to play to continue that. But that was then immediately picked up and extended nationally under Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull's administration. Fiercely independent, Penington Institute has been the trailblazer in education, advocacy and constructive drug policy reform. As you know, through the Community Overdose Prevention Program, Penington has empowered tens of thousands of frontline workers with training, webinars and consultations. John Ryan, whom you know, our most irrepressible CEO, has made more presentations, contributions to governments, addresses to parliamentary reforms and inquiries, and offered great advice in community policy arenas on harm minimisation and drug education than anyone I know. And I've seen a lot in that space. Penington has convened the International Overdose Awareness Day, as Scott said a moment ago. It's actually on Sunday, August the 31st. It's now observed in over 42 countries, and there are over 1,000 events annually to acknowledge the tragedy of overdose. There is a huge need to shine the light on overdose and the lives lost via overdose. But say that quietly. Like cancer was many years ago, nobody wants to talk about overdose and losing a family member in this way. There will be more than one person in this room who has lost someone to overdose. Most likely it was an opioid and not an illegal drug substance. So we need to shine that light clearly and develop very good public policies in harmony with pharma companies, with the communities, and to find ways to prevent these deaths. The other area of Penington's work that I've watched grow and change and is so topical and vital in public policy reform is cannabis reform. The Institute publishes the Cannabis in Australia report every year, identifying trends, attitudes and policy. And by the way, for those of us who might be over the age of 65, there's only one or two of us in the room, just note that the Gen Z and the millennials are becoming quite the political force in this country, and their attitudes to cannabis reform may be quite different to some of ours. It is timely to put this issue on the table and to hold this discussion when we see in many parts of the world where it's been legalised, if not decriminalised. So for me, this reform is very vital because there's a complete change in public policy and public attitude, and we need to move with the times, as they say. Meaningful change is hard. I don't think any of us were around for the suffragettes, but let me tell you, there was great community disruption when the suffragettes were looking for universal voting rights. And I do remember the days of the establishment of free healthcare in this country and how that was railed against by the medical profession. That will never change. That's a given. It's a sine qua non. It is the way we look after in this country each other and care for each other. But we as a community have to decide that inaction is not an option. So you can see my passion about Penington Institute when I still refer to it as we. I don't think one ever leaves Penington. You might actually vacate a role, a more clearly public role, but you never leave. But over these years, I have seen the community change its policies and start to ask the questions, and that's where we need to position Penington, because if David were here, he would be insisting that we develop good public policy, which is good for the community and good for all of our members, and particularly our young ones. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Catherine. That was great. We'd like to introduce you to our next speaker. We're honoured to have the Honourable Tony Parsons joining us today to share his reflections on 4 decades of work at the intersection of law and community. Tony was in private practice as a solicitor before becoming the Managing Director of Victorian Legal Aid from 2000 to 2008. After this time, he served as a magistrate for 15 years, 9 of these as Principal Magistrate of the Dandenong, then Melbourne Drug Courts. Before retiring from the bench, he served as the Victorian Supervising Drug Court Magistrate. Welcome, Tony, and thanks for accepting our invitation to deliver the David Penington Oration 2025.
Can you hear me? Yes. Good. Thank you very much, Professor Wilson, and also Catherine Greiner. I would like to join you, Professor, and also acknowledge that we are on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Waiwurrung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to thank you, Professor, as Chair of Penington's Board, for inviting me to deliver this year's Penington Oration. It is a very great honour indeed. Thank you. And also to Catherine Greiner AO for your insightful and excellent coverage of the history of Penington and the great work that it does. To the many members of the Penington family that are present today, may I say to you that your Professor David was a giant amongst giants, and that this community owes him a very great and eternal debt of gratitude for the work that he's done. Also, may I welcome and thank the honourable members of Parliament who attended today's oration, and to family and friends, thank you all for being here today. This is great, standing in this wonderful House of Parliament to speak about one of my favourite topics, cannabis policy, to such an esteemed audience. I'm really excited. So let's make a start. I want to take you on a journey through the years to highlight some of the milestones of the reform movement. But before I do, I just want to shed some light on a simple concept you'll hear several times today called harm minimisation. We apply harm minimisation strategies to all areas of human activity. Seat belts, speed limits and traffic lights are all part of a broad harm minimisation strategy that prevents harm on our roads. In the context of alcohol consumption, harm minimisation strategies include age limits on hotels and restaurants that sell and serve liquor. It includes limits on the level of blood alcohol that people can have before they get behind the wheel of a car. In the context of drug use, there are many harm minimisation strategies, and in the context of illicit drug use, they include making sure that there's an availability of sterile injecting equipment so that we can avoid the communicatable diseases that arise from people who share syringes. It also includes providing safe injecting rooms and other strategies that we'll talk about shortly. But let's start this journey. It's a journey across my adult lifetime, starting with me as a student at Monash University in the 1970s and covering my time as a lawyer, as the head of Victoria Legal Aid and as the Supervising Magistrate of Victoria's Drug Court. It's a story that I hope provides a suitable tribute to the legacy of David Penington. David championed rational and compassionate drug policies. I hope today's oration is a timely reminder that the community's current approach to drug policy still falls well short of his aspirations to have our policymakers and our parliaments address harms caused by ineffective drug policies. So this speech isn't strictly about me, it's about what I've seen and learned, because to some extent I've had a front row seat to the failures, follies and successes of drug policy in Australia over a long period of time. I've seen what communities can achieve when we have foresight and ambition and when we do the hard work in the pursuit of drug policy progress. I've also seen what happens when we do nothing. We are 25 years into the now not so new century, and some of the simplest and most effective drug policy reforms still seem to elude us and leave us supporting failed policies that actually continue to do real harm in our community. But fear not. Progressive thinkers, like the organisation that bears David's name and is sponsoring today's event, have proposed a logical next step, a clear pathway for reform with which we can challenge our parliaments and policymakers. More on that shortly. Every good story has a beginning, and mine starts in the summer of 1972, when I first started to really understand the positive impact of progressive public policy. On the 2nd of December 1972, for the first time in 23 years, the Liberal Country Party lost the federal election and the Australian Labor Party, led by that political and physical giant Gough Whitlam, was swept into power, riding high on a tsunami of popularity, summarised by the unforgettable campaign slogan, "It's time." I'd just turned 19 and I'd just completed my first year of science at Monash. I was not eligible to vote at that election, I was too young, but I was eligible to be conscripted into the army. I was eligible to go to jail for refusing to register for conscription, and I was eligible to die in a war in Vietnam on the other side of the equator. 2 months after the election, I returned to Monash to begin my second year at the university, and so much had changed over that time. Conscription had been abolished and the draft resistors released from prison. The withdrawal of Australian troops from Vietnam was well advanced. Tertiary education was now free. A universal health scheme called Medibank was being planned. A new Family Law Act providing no-fault divorce was being drafted. And the development of Aboriginal land rights and environmental protection legislation was in its early stages. My lefty mates and I surveyed this dramatically different political environment looking around for the next great political challenge, and I confessed we weren't all that sure that there was much left to do. Until someone shouted out, "Wait a minute, Gough forgot to legalise drugs." People are still being busted every day for possessing and smoking dope. And so at last the wandering lost tribes of university radicals had a new cause to pursue and began to organise and look for opportunities to influence change. Takes us to 1974, and with no meaningful reform yet apparent, enter a Mr. Jim Billington, a 35-year-old, articulate, utterly charming hippie with a plaited ponytail and colourful embroidered jeans and a very, very sharp mind. He established the Cannabis Research Foundation of Australia with its headquarters in Greville Street, Paran, and assembled an advisory committee of luminaries from the legal and scientific communities which added respectability to the Cannabis Research Foundation, its primary goal to legalise cannabis. And incidentally, Robert Richter, KC, who joins us today, was one of the founding members of that advisory committee. The organisation was funded by public subscription and also, according to Victoria Police, the selling of green vegetable matter in the car park behind the Greville Street office. Two raids by the drug squad firmly put a stop to that alleged activity, and wisely Mr Billington decamped to Sydney to establish the foundation offices there, a little later in South Australia and then in the ACT. So, whilst not entirely a national activist organisation, it certainly had a strong presence in the populous southeast quadrant of the continent. Which brings us to 1977. The year of 1977 proved significant for cannabis reform for three reasons. Firstly, the Senate Standing Committee on Social Welfare report, Drug Problems in Australia, had the Baum report, named after Liberal Senator Peter Baum, had this to say: "Drug use arises within our society of which we're all a part. People who use drugs and blanket moral protestations of their evil are largely hypocritical. The lack of rational debate on the cannabis problem inhibits the development of rational methods of control of cannabis use, and also rational discussion and action in relation to the more serious problem we have of opiate abuse." In summary, the Standing Committee recognised that the legal classification as a criminal offence caused harm to the user, the classification rather than the drug itself. Their report recommended the possession of marijuana for personal use should no longer be treated as a crime, should only attract a fine of a fixed amount with an appearance at court being optional, and could not be used in any form of application for employment. So as a moment in history, this was a huge breakthrough. It was the first time in modern Australia that a parliamentary body recommended a reform of cannabis policy founded on principles of harm minimisation. 1977 also saw the formation of the AMP, not the Australian Mutual Provident Fund, but the Australian Marijuana Party. In the December federal election of that year, it stood candidates in 3 states, Victoria, New South Wales and South Australia, and received 50,000 first preference votes, prompting the Australian newspaper to comment a surprisingly good outcome for the Australian Marijuana Party, making them, in effect, the 5th best supported political party in the country. The campaign attracted huge media attention. Finally, in 1977, the outrageous publication called The Australasian Weed, All the Dope on Dope, was published out of Melbourne by Noxious Weed Press, an organisation closely aligned with the Australian Marijuana Party. Under the heading of extremist literature on cannabis, the above-mentioned Senate Standing Committee described it in these terms: "There's grown up a whole corpus of literature which extols and promotes the use of cannabis in a quite unscientific and polemic fashion." This newspaper had ruffled the feathers of the establishment. And recently these publications have made their way onto the bookshelves of newsagents and legitimate bookstores. We are distressed that such material is made available through legitimate and otherwise responsible retail outlets. A side note, the Classification Department immediately slapped a ban on the Australasian weed. That received mainstream publicity and the print run sold out overnight. The next publication was retitled because the Australasian weed was banned. Out came the Australasian seed. It was banned. Publicity ensured. That print run sold out overnight. And on it went until the Australasian plead, which wasn't banned. Silence from the Classification Board. Sales plummeted. And subsequent editions went for 3 or 4 rounds, and then Noxious Weed Press closed its doors. So that was an interesting experiment. Clearly the light bulb went on in the Publications Classification Board. Brings us to 1978 and the New South Wales Parliament's progress report of its Standing Committee on Drugs and Drug Use forthrightly stated. It is abundantly evident, this is 1978, right? It is abundantly evident that there are a great number of sane, balanced and rational people, many exercising unquestionable adult responsibility, who are using cannabis without obvious impairment either to themselves or to society. These people are found in all walks of life, and it would be folly to ignore the growing social stress which must be arising from the fact that a great many young adults, by indulging in a drug which they see as less damaging than alcohol, run the risk not only of involvement with the criminal law, but also having the prospect of ruined careers if they attract a criminal record. Indeed, it must be a serious concern for everybody that we're spending vast sums on their education and training which could be wasted if they're dismissed because they get a criminal conviction. 1979, the year after, followed when the South Australian Royal Commission into the non-medical use of drugs published its report, an extensive report, recommending the adoption of a partial prohibition model to permit private cultivation and use and also a small cultivation of cannabis, including gratuitous distribution to friends and members of their household, other than having to recourse the illicit market. So the Commission further noted in South Australia that the reform, if it takes place, is likely to also make some inroads to the illicit market if users choose to grow a plant or two rather than sourcing their cannabis from organised criminal associates. 1979 also saw the declaration by cannabis law reform activists of the first National Marijuana Day on the 9th of November. Thousands occupied the streets of capital cities, including the Bourke Street Mall and a march down Swanston Street, in Hyde Park in Sydney, Festival Plaza in Adelaide and St George's Square in Brisbane, and in other capital and major rural centres. Then to 1981. 1981 saw the occurrence of the first international cannabis conference, first international cannabis legalisation conference in no other place than, of course, Amsterdam, where since 1976, an important year for another reason I'll come to shortly, coffee shops had been permitted to legally supply customers with cannabis, as they continue to do today. Australia sent a delegation of just one person, me. Back to 1976 was a most significant year for the modern evolution of medicinal cannabis, when United States citizen Robert Randall won a legal court battle to be the first person in the USA, one out of 240 million people, to be provided with medicinal cannabis, in his case to treat his glaucoma. I met Robert at that 1981 conference along with his wife, Alice O'Leary Randall. Robert, internationally recognised now as the father of the medicinal cannabis movement, unfortunately passed away in 2001, but his wife, Alice, continues the campaign for wider access to medicinal cannabis. We happened to renew our acquaintanceship this year, 44 years later, at a medicinal cannabis conference in Brisbane. I'm honoured today to know that Alice has joined us, I believe, online from Florida, where it happens to be 3 a.m. in the morning. Alice, we salute you. So this brings us to 1983, and in Victoria, that year brought an historic Labor government to power. After 27 years in opposition, the Kane government was full of reformist zeal, and in 1983 it enacted the Drugs, Poisons and Controlled Substances Act to replace the previous drug legislation, the Poisons Act. This new progressive legislation, developed under the stewardship of Health Minister David White, was the first of its kind in Australia. It replaced the maximum penalty of 12 months jail just for using Indian hemp with a maximum penalty of $500 fine. And absent any evidence of trafficking, the new law required the courts to impose a non-conviction good behaviour bond for possession, use or cultivation of cannabis for first-time offenders. It was a modest reform, but certainly in the right direction, and a fine example of the Victorian Parliament taking the lead in this area of law reform, and other jurisdictions were quick to follow. In 1987, the reforms continued with the South Australian government introducing the notion of a simple cannabis offence, being possession of up to 100 grams of leaf or 20 grams of resin, or growing a plant. The new law dealt with those offences with an expiation notice, essentially an on-the-spot fine, and if paid, that ended the matter. An expiation notice did not constitute an admission or finding of guilt, so no criminal record arose and no court appearance was required. Which takes us to the years after that, 1989, it was the ACT's turn. They put in place the simple cannabis offence notice system, and under that scheme, police simply issued offenders with a $100 fine, a ticket payable within 60 days for cannabis possession or cultivation of threshold amounts of up to 25 grams of cannabis or 2 non-hydroponic plants. For those of us who had commenced our adult and professional lives in the aura of the Whitlam government's reformist zeal, there had been some sense towards the end of the 1980s that really strong, sensible policy based on harm minimisation of cannabis was just around the corner. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. There was a brief glimmer of further significant reform in a major way in this state, Victoria, in 1996, when the Liberal Premier of the time, Jeff Kennett, set up a drug advisory council, chaired, I might add, by Professor David Penington, to find a solution to illicit drugs. Based on Australian and international experience and advice that prohibition and policing were both ineffective and promoted criminal involvement and delivered substantial harm, that would harm and harm again, the council recommended that marijuana should be decriminalised and a heroin injection trial initiated. While the recommendations won the support of the Premier, Mr Kennett, elements of the coalition party room unfortunately closed ranks and halted any prospect of reform arising out of that inquiry. Furthermore, any hope of that era of reform might have, that the era of reform might have continued, ended with a thud In 1997, when the Howard government launched the national illicit drug strategy called Tough on Drugs. The strategy committed more resources to drug law enforcement and was underpinned by prime ministerial zeal, declaring this government is all for zero tolerance. Just a few short years after the door of sensible drug reform had apparently been shut, my career took a significant turn that once again put me in a position which highlighted the urgent need for policy reform in the way we deal with drug issues. On completion of my law degree, and given my background in activism in drug law reform, the only lawyers willing to offer me a job were a small firm of 4 lawyers practising criminal law, and doubtless they hoped I would attract clients to the practice, and so it was. That firm was based in Fitzroy Street, St Kilda. Working in the St Kilda of the 1980s and 1990s was my first exposure to people who were addicted to heroin. Not the lawyers, I'm quick to add, but their clients. They were mostly young adults. In the case of women, they paid for their heroin and came to the attention of police, mostly through street-based prostitution and small-scale theft. It wasn't too hard to help them stay out of prison, but they led sad and wretched lives, and they aged very quickly, literally in front of one's eyes. The males of this group really had little option but to steal cars or burgle houses, shops or other commercial premises, and it was much harder to keep them out of jail. My second job commenced in the year 2000 when I was appointed the Managing Director of Victoria Legal Aid, still this state's largest criminal law and family law practice, which at the time employed 250 lawyers and in partnership with the private profession delivered legal representation in 42,000 cases every year. I'd gone from one of the state's smallest legal practices to one of its largest. The latter job once again highlighted the vulnerability of people when our drug laws are not predicated on the notion of harm minimisation. The destruction of addicted lives, the loss of hope engendered by lost years in jail at a huge cost to the community was similar to my Fitzroy Street experience, but on a much grander scale at Victoria Legal Aid. However, I'm pleased to say that not all drug policy reform had been entirely halted during the decade following John Howard's failed tough on drugs approach. Starting with New South Wales in 1999, many states, including Victoria, had introduced the concept of drug courts to integrate intensive drug treatment into the justice system in response to the most serious drug-related crimes. In 2012, 4 years after I was appointed a magistrate, I was assigned to the Drug Court Division, where I remained for 11 years, including serving as its supervising magistrate. It was a very refreshing break from the revolving door of the General Criminal Law Division of the Magistrates Court, because the Drug Court actually works, and that's energising for the magistrates and for the rest of the Drug Court team. And in that role, I learnt a lot about addiction. We all do things in our lives that have the potential to become addictive behaviours. For example, we all eat. It's necessary to support life, of course. But for some amongst us, eating can become an addictive behaviour, with the consequent obesity having all kinds of negative life consequences physically and mentally, including serious and sometimes fatal disease. Exactly the same can be said for alcohol. In moderation, it's fine. For gambling, in moderation, it's fine. But if the consumption pattern escalates to a level of addiction, the outcome can also be ruinous and or fatal. Understanding that reality, I return to the subject of cannabis law reforms that many of my generation first hypothesised back in the early 1970 years, some 50 years later, that still seem elusive. Cannabis reform is fundamental to a harm minimisation approach to drug policy. What distinguishes cannabis from legal recreational drugs like alcohol is the connection cannabis has with the illegal drug industry. Not because of any innate property of the cannabis itself, but because the laws which criminalise cannabis compel cannabis users into a market where they are exposed to vastly riskier substances like opiates, synthetic opiates and amphetamines. Those riskier drugs distinguish themselves from cannabis because, unlike cannabis, they are highly physically addictive, highly biologically destructive, with the capacity to be lethal. On top of that, they are vastly more profitable to their vendors than marijuana. So the vendors love cannabis prohibition. It guarantees them a captive market of cannabis consumers, some of whom will be enticed across to the other vastly more profitable drugs, vastly more destructive drugs. Our current drug policies force cannabis consumers into a black market, and our current cannabis laws only serve to preserve and protect that black market dynamic. So if this is to change, Australia desperately needs another jolt of political leadership to advance the next wave of sensible drug policy reform. Nevertheless, over the decade, we have still seen some governments around Australia once again take modest steps towards sensible cannabis policy. In the mid-2010s, 2016 to be precise, both the Andrews State Government and the Turnbull Commonwealth Government embraced a national scheme of medicinal cannabis to make it available via prescription, and that's been a wonderful national breakthrough. The ACT now permits possession of 50 grams of dried cannabis or 150 grams of wet cannabis, and also permits the non-hydroponic cultivation of 2 plants per adult per household, with a maximum of 4 plants per household. But the missing piece of the puzzle is, of course, the establishment of a regulated market rather than a criminal-run black market to which people have to have recourse if they want cannabis but can't grow it. And again in Victoria, we see a recent reform of our driving laws, led by the Honourable Rachel Payne MLC and David Penington MLC, who are both present today. That reform gives the Magistrates Court a discretion not to cancel the driver's licence of medicinal cannabis patients who test positive to cannabis at roadside tests where there's no evidence of actual driving impairment. Seems common sense, it applies to every other drug, but previously licence cancellation for those with a medicinal marijuana script was mandatory. So that's a great reform. And in the lead up to that reform, I had the honour of undertaking at the request of the government a wide consultation with police, courts, health and road safety peak bodies to test the stakeholder appetite for this change. It was strongly supported by most stakeholders and actually passed through Parliament with bipartisan support. That reform, I might also add, is another first in Australia and is yet another example of the Victorian Parliament demonstrating its willingness to lead the rest of the nation in the development and implementation of sensible drug policy. While these are all important steps, they're still small steps and far well short of where our ambition should be. So returning to where this oration started, right now, here in Victoria, to borrow the Whitlam campaign slogan, it's time. It's time for an approach that will make our society safer and fairer. It's time for a tightly regulated cannabis market like the one envisaged by the Penington Institute in their recently published Penington Cannabis Control Plan. The plan's a comprehensive blueprint for how we can responsibly and effectively regulate cannabis. At its heart It's all about taking control of an uncontrolled market currently run by criminals and replacing it with a regulated system that prioritises health, safety and community well-being. Under the Penington model, adults would be allowed to buy and consume cannabis, but only under strict conditions. And whilst the plan has 20 controls, some of the key ones are adult access only. Cannabis would only be available to people aged 18 and over. Plain packaging, no flashy branding, no marketing, just clear factual information. Potency limits, caps on THC concentration to reduce risk levels. No public consumption. Cannabis would be restricted to private places and regulated points of sale. And to finish, a complete ban on advertising. That's right, no promotion, no sponsorship, no glamorisation. This is the sensible middle ground. That's right, no promotion, no sponsorship, no glamorisation. It's a carefully considered reform backed by evidence and designed to reduce harm. So I've reflected today on over half a century of drug policy advances in the right direction in my view, but modest in scope in my word. It's been a tediously slow process. And frankly, once we acknowledge that the current prohibition approach is ineffective and doing great damage and that other approaches are available, inaction equates to acceptance of avoidable and ongoing harm. And yet this is where we find ourselves, waiting for one of our parliaments to step forward, show leadership and declare inaction is no longer an option. And let's be clear, every day we wait is another day we needlessly stigmatise and criminalise users. Another day we waste money on failed law reform initiatives. Another day we allow the crime gangs to rake in the profits from cannabis sales. A tightly regulated cannabis market is, however, a carefully considered reform backed by evidence and designed to reduce harm. It's an approach that would make our society safer and fairer. And what's more, it's popular. A recent poll undertaken by your Gov poll indicated that the reform attracts 57% popularity and it includes net positive support across all ages and voting cohorts. So I ask rhetorically as I come to the conclusion of this oration, how often does a social reform come along that meets the holy trinity of good policy reform? It's the right thing to do, it's backed by evidence, and it enjoys broad community support. Victoria has the opportunity to lead again. Indeed, it has a history of leading the nation on drug policy. We can be the first state in Australia to embrace common sense cannabis reform. We can take control of a broken system and replace it with one that works for everybody. In my view, cannabis reform isn't just inevitable. For cannabis reform, it's time. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Ja, first name, second name. Oh, no, yeah, that's right. I love it. Thank you.
No worries. Thanks for that, David. It was really a great oration. We'd also like to thank Catherine again for her opening remarks. We'd like to thank everyone who's taken the time to join us today in the room and virtually, and also a huge thanks to the Penington Institute staff for putting on this event in the week leading up to International Overdose Awareness Day this Sunday. Again, we'd like to thank Dr. Sonay Hussain and David's children for attending. This is the end of the formal part. of our event today. And so if you'd like to stay and join us for refreshments, you're quite welcome. Opportunity for further conversation, but if you want to speak to anyone, myself or other members of the board or the staff, we can have that conversation over a cup of tea, coffee, sorry. Thanks.